Hello everybody. My name is Anne Zhang. I am a PhD student in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. Today, I'll present our work, Do Privacy Labels Answer Users' Privacy Questions? This work is in collaboration with my advisor, Professor Norman Shadeh. So notice and consent have been the foundational principles in privacy and data protection for decades, especially in the United States. So notice is typically addressed through the publication of a privacy policy. As we have heard in prior presentations, in practice, users rarely read these privacy policies, which are not just long and difficult to read, but also tend to be ambiguous or silent about important issues. So the concept of privacy nutrition labels were first introduced by Kelly and colleagues at CMU. Behind the idea is that privacy policies are faulty. And these privacy nutrition labels offer a standardized and distinct way of informing people about data collection and use practices, focusing on a small set of issues that particularly matter to most users. And later in another paper, they also introduced these nutrition labels for mobile applications. So influenced by this research, in December 2020, Apple introduced the app privacy labels on the App Store. And Google later rolled out their data safety sections. These are reminiscent of the privacy nutrition labels introduced and evaluated in research over about a decade earlier. The iOS and Google labels have been available for tens of thousands of mobile apps in the wild for a period of time, opening the door for researchers to study them. Prior research has shown that these labels suffer from usability issues. Developers have difficulties coming up with the correct and accurate labels, and also how these data practices might not match, described by these labels may not match actual data practices of the apps. And in this work, we are interested in finding out to what extent do these labels really address the privacy questions people have about their mobile apps. In other words, is the scope of these questions, whether these labels match what users have questions for. So our study leverages this publicly available data set of crowdsourced privacy questions. It's called Privacy QA dataset, which is collected by our group in an earlier study. So we use this data set because the questions and the corpus were elicited in the context intended to mimic that of a user examining an app in the App Store. Participants were presented with information about an app, including its name, description, and navigable screenshots, similar to what one would find in the App Store, and were instructed to ask privacy-related questions about it. So the set of apps were selected to cover a broad range of application categories, and also with varying levels of popularity. And the dataset contained a total of 1,750 questions, which is a sufficiently diverse collection of privacy questions. Okay. So we leveraged this dataset to explore to what extent these questions can be addressed or answered by iOS and Google Play Store mobile app labels. So we first applied meta-analysis as an organizational tool to classify and describe the questions, to understand the nature and the topics of questions asked by users and the corpus. And then we also want to see how well these questions can be answered or addressed by these privacy labels. So we did not examine the actual privacy labels of these apps for a variety of reasons. First, there might be issues of these labels not accurately describing what the apps does. And some apps only exist in Google Play Store, not in iOS. And some apps do not actually contain privacy labels. So we try to see whether these privacy labels have the capacity to address users' privacy questions. And this is a summary of the themes and their relative frequencies. From our thematic analysis, we identified 18 question themes. And the most frequent question themes revolves around the data being collected. So questions such as, what information do you collect? Do they collect credit card information? So either they are asking what information in general the app collects or specific data being collected by an. That counted for about 22% of the questions. And the next is approximately 12% of the apps in the corpus related to app security, encompassing a variety of topics, such as the overall security of the app, recent security breaches. For example, how safe is my account information on this app? Has this company had data breaches in the past? Even though participants will receive prompts to ask privacy-related questions, they ask security-related questions as well, indicating they view their security questions as legitimate privacy questions. And the next, the third most frequent theme revolves around data sharing. Questions such as, does it share my personal information with others? Is it possible for health insurance companies to get a hold of my data? And then the next one is data selling. These questions usually ask whether an app sells the data or not, or what types of data is being sold, or to whom the data is being sold to. And the fifth most frequent theme is, does the app use, it revolves around the permissions, the type of permissions that apps might need, such as whether a specific permission, for example, camera or microphone, is accessed, or the necessary permissions for this app to function properly. Examples such as, does the app use my camera at any point? What permissions will this app need? And the sixth most frequent pertain to specific privacy questions related to the functionalities and features of the app. So, for example, on this question regarding Favor, I think I pronounced correctly, which is an online marketplace for freelance services. It says, who can see which task I hire workers for? And another example is with TripAdvisor. The question reads, could my trip information be made public, allowing someone to know when I'm not home? And these questions are about 7.8% of all the questions. All right. So these are the list of remaining question themes. These top six, which is about 1/3 of themes, cover 2/3 of the questions in the data set. And the remaining 12 themes cover about the 1/3 of all the questions. You can see it's a long tail. I won't have time to go into details, but the questions ask about the purposes, who has access, privacy risks, data retention, etc. And now let's move on to see how these question themes can be addressed or answered by the labels. And remember, the most frequent questions are about data collected, which is 22% of the questions. And both Google and Apple contains label entries specific to the data type being collected. And it contains a variety of different data types. But not all of the questions can be answered by the labels. And this also varies between Apple and Google. The Google labels cannot answer questions related to whether this data is anonymous, because Apple's privacy sections contain a section called data not linked to you. So any data listed under that section is supposed to be anonymous. And Apple also doesn't contain a data categories such as call logs, IP addresses, calendar information that Google label has. And Google labels also allow developers to indicate what data types are optional, where users do not have to provide that information in order to use that app. And Apple doesn't have that. And so both of the labels do not address whether the user's location is being persistently accessed or collected in the background. There are also app-specific data types, such as gestures or the typed phrases for a keyboard app. That these data-specific types are not covered by the Apple's or Google's listed data types. Okay. And the next top theme is security. By the name, Google's data safety sections contain information about security, while Apple's labels are silent about these issues. So App developers can declare optionally in Google labels that their app has been independently validated against a global standard called MASA, which is Mobile Application Security Assessment. This review covers a wide range of security-related topics, addressing many of the questions in this app security theme, such as password handling and encryption. And of course, the review does not cover all the security questions the participant had. For example, does not indicate how payment information is stored, or cannot help answer questions about past data breaches or 2FA. And the next big topic is data sharing. Both labels provide information on whether an app shares data and the types of data being shared, but neither label directly states with whom the data is shared, only referring to them as third parties in general. Apple label actually requires disclosure of data sharing when it's used for advertising or tracking purposes. Well, Google's label require developers to disclose any non-first party sharing, but none of them address specifically with whom the data is being shared. Okay, and another question theme that's implicit answered by Apple's labels, not Google's, is related to data selling. By Apple's definitions of tracking, it means that data is being shared with a data broker. So by CCPA's definition, that means selling. So any data declared under data used to track you in Apple's labels would be considered to be sold. And of course, it doesn't answer the question is who selling to whom, except the general category of data brokers or third-party advertisers. And both Google and Apple labels addressed most questions related to the purpose of data collection. While they adopt slightly different definitions and purposes, both include categories such as app functionality, analytics, product personalization, advertising, marketing. And Google label also include information about data deletion, while Apple's label does not contain such information. Google enable developers to declare whether the app data can be deleted, but it does not answer users' questions about whether they can delete specific data instead of deleting their account as a whole. Right. So this is a summary of what we have looked at and the themes. And you can see the main difference between Apple and Google comes down to that Google contains app security information, while Apple contains information about selling. And the bottom of the list is the questions that are not answered by either of the labels. You can see it's a long tail of questions. So you can see in total, the takeaway is that these labels, even though useful, still address fewer than 50% of people's privacy questions. And one way that we think of to include additional information is the data recipients. So for example, in the case of sharing and selling, users are interested in knowing with whom the data is being shared or sold to. They're interested in whether, health insurers or Facebook or Google has my data, or the government or the app employees for the app company can see my data. And this is, of course, consistent with the privacy and contextual integrity framework, where the data recipient is imperative to the information flow. And then another set of questions missing is related to app permissions. About 8.5% of questions are related to asking whether an app accesses specific permissions of the phone. It is important to know that accessing information in an app does not equate to collecting that information, because by Google and Apple's definition, data collection only occurs when the information leaves the device. So in other words, the label entries about data collected by an app does not allow us to answer questions about permissions used by an app. Google's label used to contain this list of permissions in the label, but then they remove it at in their current version of the labels. I guess this is important because the app permission list is only available to users after they install it on their phone. So having this information in the label prior to installation is important. And the privacy labels can already be pretty long and complex. For example, the DoorDash iOS privacy labels contain over 100 label entries. And we have seen that from our analysis that these labels only address less than half of the questions. And there's a long tail of diverse questions that are not answered by these labels. So there is really a limit to how far these labels can go, and hence calls for the new efforts to work on privacy question answering functionalities, especially with the investment in natural language processing and question answering. And this way that we can decrease user burden, that users don't have to go through the whole list of labels to find out the information they're interested. And also this way, it helps to address app-specific privacy questions. All right. So we are interested in the question, do privacy labels answer user privacy questions? Of course, its limitation is that this is a privacy experts or privacy apprentices view of whether these questions are answered, not users' interpretations of the whether these questions are answered, which is a more of an optimistic view on this. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you. I'm looking forward to any questions.
Hi, I'm Naman. I'm from Wisconsin. Great presentation. The slide that you mentioned that Google and Apple focus on different aspects of marketing and selling information. Do you have a sense of why that is the case? Maybe like they have like different strategies, like they want to appear differently to the users?
I cannot say why they have different approach, but I can say Apple has this tracking stop. If you are familiar with iOS, they have this stop tracking functionality that is related to their definition of tracking that impacted a lot of other apps' business models. The users can choose to turn off tracking. And that way, my sense is that Apple's more of a hardware company than a software company, and their business models are different in the sense that they do not make money by selling data or, but that's just, I can't say what actually Google and Apple rationale is.
Hi, that was a great presentation. And it was very interesting to see that permissions, which is considered to be the basis of privacy policy analysis, is not being answered by these labels. But these labels are at least a step towards informing the users about privacy. So in your expert opinion and based on the analysis, which is really great, what would your recommendations be for these companies? How can they address the various unanswered questions, particularly what you mentioned in the second to last slide?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's a great opportunity for future research because as we all know, the data practices of apps can be very complex and very complex for users to understand. Even though, the definitions are listed on their website, users may not know their definitions when they have different interpretations of the definition. So that's where I really see this almost like a chatbot question answering thing really be helpful. They say, the users can ask a lot of questions. Like, what do you mean by this? And then they can give examples or more concrete answers, or more concrete data types or examples of data that's being collected, things like that. And I guess with, the big fuss about ChatGPT and you see all the things that large language models can do, there might be some research direction along that line where such functionalities can be leveraged to help with this, where previously it's, you can only do this with maybe, a customer service where a human is answering your question.